Okay. Hello and welcome back. Today is, what's today? Oh, I can't even think. Today is November 29th, 2024. It's Friday, and we are reading chapter 23 of Lirael by Garth Nix. I am absolutely pooped today. It's my moon time, and I'm wearing the same sweatshirt that I had on yesterday again today. I've got my warm blanket. I have on my super duper fuzzy socks. I've got my vessel earrings on that my friend Emily made. And it is day 2 of my time to rest. But I am pushing on and I'm gonna read this book. So I'm looking forward to seeing what chapter 23 is. I remember getting to this part of the book before when I was reading. And I remember thinking, oh my god, it just keeps going back and forth. So now we're going back again to Prince Samuth time. So anyways, let's get started. I'll stop rambling. Chapter 23, A Troublesome Season. Prince Samuth stood shivering on the narrow sentry walk of the palace's second tallest tower. He was wearing his heaviest fur cloak, but the wind still cut through it, and he couldn't be bothered to cast a charter spell for warmth. He half wanted to catch a cold, because it would mean escaping from the training schedule Elamir had forced upon him. He was standing on the sentry walk for 2 reasons. The first reason was that he wanted to look out in the hope that he would see either his father or his mother returning. The second was that he wanted to avoid Elamir and everyone else who wanted to organize his life. Sam missed his parents, not just because they might free him from Elamir's tyranny, but Sabriel was constantly in demand away from Belisir, flying her red and gold paper wing from one trouble spot to the next. It was a bad winter, people repeatedly said in Sam's hearing, with so much activity from the dead and from free magic creatures. Sam always shivered inside as they said it, knowing their eyes were on him and that he should be studying the Book of the Dead, preparing himself to help his mother. He should be studying now, he thought glumly, but he continued to stare out over the frosted roofs of the city and through the rising smoke of thousands of cozy fires. He hadn't opened the book at all since Elamir had given it to him. The green and silver volume remained safely locked in a cupboard in his workroom. He thought about it every day and looked at it, but couldn't bring himself to actually read it. In fact, he spent the hours he was supposed to be studying it trying to work out how he could tell his mother that he couldn't. He couldn't read the book, and he couldn't face going into death again. Elamir allowed him 2 hours a day for study of the book, or abhorsen prep, as she called it. But Sam did no reading. He wrote instead. Speech after speech, in which he tried to explain his feelings and his fears. Letters to Sabriel, letters to Touchstone, letters to both parents. All of them ended up in the fire. I'll just tell her, announced Sam to the wind. He didn't speak too loudly, in case the sentry on the far side of the tower heard him. The guards already thought he was a miserable excuse for a prince. He didn't want them thinking he was a mad prince as well. No, I'll tell Dad, and then he can tell her, he added after a moment's thought. But Touchstone had barely returned from Estwao when he had had to ride south to the guard fort at Barhedron Hill, just north of the wall. There had been reports that the Ancelstiarans were allowing groups of Sutherling refugees to cross the wall and settle in the Old Kingdom, or in actuality, to be killed by the creatures or wild folk who roamed the borderlands. Touchstone had gone to investigate these reports, to see what the Ancelstiarans were up to, and to save any of the Sutherlings who might have survived. Stupid Ancelstiarans, muttered Sam, kicking the wall. Unfortunately, his other foot slipped on the icy stone, and he skidded into the wall, smacking his funny bone. Ow! He exclaimed, clutching his elbow. Blast it! You all right, sir? Asked the guard, who came at a run, his hobnailed boots providing much better purchase than Sam's rabbit-furred slippers. You don't want to break a leg? Sam scowled. He knew that the prospect of his dancing the bird of dawning provided no end of amusement for the guards. His sense of self-worth wasn't helped by their badly disguised snickering, or the ease with which Elamir practiced her own future role, acting as co-regent with grace and authority, at least to everyone except Sam. Sam's stumbling rehearsals for the Bird of Dawning part in the midwinter and midsummer festivals was only one of the many areas in which he displayed himself as poorer royal material than his sister. He couldn't pretend enthusiasm for the dances. He often fell asleep in petticoat, and while he knew he was a very competent swordsman, he somehow didn't feel like stretching his ability to practice with the guards. Nor did he show up well at perspective. Elamir always threw herself into the task at hand, working like fury. Sam did quite the reverse, staring into space and worrying about his clouded future, often becoming so engrossed that he stopped doing whatever he was supposed to be doing. "Sir, are you all right?" the guard repeated. Sam blinked. There, he was doing it again, staring into space while he thought about staring into space. "Yes, thank you," he said, flexing his gloved fingers. "Slipped. Hit my funny bone." "See anything interesting out there?" asked the guard. His name was Brel, Sam remembered. Quite a friendly guard, not one who stifled a smile every time Sam walked past in his Bird of Dawning costume. "No," Sam replied, shaking his head. He looked out again, down into the interior of the city. The Midwinter Festival was to start in a few days. Construction of the Frost Fair was in full swing. A great, bustling tent town on the frozen surface of Lake Locere, the Frost Fair had pageant wagons and players, jesters and jugglers, musicians and magicians, exhibitions and expositions, and all sorts of games, not to mention food from every corner of the Old Kingdom and beyond. Lake Locere covered 90 acres of Belisair's central valley, but the Frost Fair overflowed it, extending into the public gardens that lined the lake shore. Sam had always liked the Frost Fair, but he looked down on it now without interest. All he could feel was a cold and black depression. "All the fun of the fair," said Brill, clapping his hands together. "It looks like it'll be a good festival this year." "Does it?" asked Sam bleakly. He would have to dance on the final day of the festival as the Bird of Dawning. It was his job to carry the green sprig of spring at the tail end of the winter procession, behind snow, hail, sleet, fog, storm, and frost. They were all professional dancers on stilts, so they not only loomed threateningly over the bird, but also showed up Sam's lack of expertise. The winter dance was long and complicated, weaving through 2 miles of the fair's winding ways. But it was much longer than that, because there was lots of doubling back as the 6 spirits of winter ducked around the bird and tried to prolong their season by stealing the sprig of spring from under Sam's golden wing, or by tripping him up with their stilts. There had been 2 full rehearsals so far. The spirits of winter were supposed to fail at tripping the bird, but so far, even the skill of the other dancers couldn't prevent the bird from tripping himself. By the end of the first rehearsal, the bird had fallen 3 times and bent its beak twice, and certainly had extremely ruffled feathers. The second rehearsal had been even worse, when the bird crashed into Sleet and knocked her off her stilts. The new Sleet still wouldn't talk to him. "They say a hard practice means an easy dance," said Brill. Sam nodded and looked away from the guard. There was no sign of a paperwing gliding in against the wind, or a troop of horsemen bearing the royal banner on the southern road. It was a waste of time looking for his parents. Brill coughed into his glove. Sam glanced back as the guard inclined his head and resumed his slow march around the sentry walk, his trumpet bumping gently on its strap against his back. Sam went downstairs. He was already late for the next rehearsal. Brill was wrong about the bad rehearsals meaning a successful dance. Sam bumbled and stumbled all his way through it, and only the professionalism and energy of the 6 spirits saved the dance from disaster. Traditionally, all the dancers from the festival ate with the royal family at the palace after the dance, but Sam chose to stay away. They'd done enough to him, and he'd done enough, with the bruises to show for it. He was sure Sleet had deliberately smacked him with her stilt near the end. She was the sister of the one he'd knocked off her stilts in rehearsal. Instead of attending the dinner, Sam retired to his workshop, trying to forget his troubles in the construction of a particularly intricate and interesting magical mechanical toy. Elamir sent a page to get him, but could do no more without embarrassing everyone, so he was left in peace, for that night at least. But not the next day, or the days following. Elamir couldn't, or wouldn't, see that Sam's sullenness came from genuine trouble, so she simply made up more things for him to do. Even worse, she started foisting the younger sisters of her own friends on him, clearly thinking that a good woman could sort out whatever was wrong with him. Naturally, Sam took an instant dislike to anyone Elamir so obviously seated next to him at dinner, or who just happened to drop by his workroom with a broken bracelet catch to be mended. His constant worry about the book and his mother's return left him little energy to pursue friendships, let alone romantic attachments. So he earned the reputation of being stiff and distant, not only among the young women introduced to him by Elamir, but to everyone of his own age around the palace. Even people who had been his friends in previous years, when he was home for the holidays, found that they no longer enjoyed his company. Sam, caught up in his own troubles and busy with his official duties, hardly noticed that people of his own age avoided him. He did talk to Brel a bit, since they both tended to be up the second tallest tower around the same time. Fortunately, the guard was not naturally talkative, and also didn't seem to mind Sam's silences, or his tendency to stop and just stare out over the city and the sea. "Your birthday today," said Brel, early one clear and very cold morning. The moon was still visible, and there was a ring around it, as only happens on the coldest nights of winter. Sam nodded. Since it occurred 2 weeks after the midwinter festival, his birthday was always somewhat eclipsed by the greater event. This year, it was made even less spectacular by the continued absence of Sabriel and Touchstone, who could only send messages and presents that, while obviously carefully chosen, did not cheer Sam. Particularly since one was a surcoat with silver keys of the Abhorsen on a deep blue field, quartered with the royal line's golden castle on a red field, and the other was a book entitled Merchain on the Binding of Free Magic Elementals. "Get any good presents?" asked Brel. "Surcoat," said Sam, "and a book." "Ah," said Brel. He clapped his hands together to regain circulation. "Not a sword, then? Or a dog?" Sam shook his head. He didn't want a sword or a dog, but either would have been more welcome than what he'd been given. "Expect Princess Elamir will get you something good," Brel said after a long, thoughtful pause. "I doubt it," said Sam. "She'll probably organize some sort of lesson." Brel clapped his hands together again, stood still, and slowly scanned the horizon from south to north. "Happy birthday," he said, when his head had finished its slow movement. "What is it? 18?" "17," replied Sam. "Ah," said Brel, and he walked around to the other side of the tower to repeat his scan of the horizon. Sam went back downstairs. Elamir did organize a birthday feast in the great hall, but it was a lackluster affair, mainly due to Sam's depressing influence. He refused to dance, because it was the one day when he could refuse, and since it was his birthday, that meant no one else could dance either. He refused to open his presents in front of everyone, because he didn't feel like it, and he merely toyed with the grilled swordfish with lime and buttered small wheat that had once been his favorite dish. In fact, he acted like a spoiled and sulky brat of 7, rather than like a young man of 17. Sam knew it, but felt unable to stop. It was the first time in weeks that he'd been able to refuse Elamir's orders or, as she called them, strong suggestions. The feast ended early, with everyone cross and short-tempered. Sam went straight to his workroom, ignoring the whispers and sidelong looks as he left the hall. He didn't care what everyone thought, though he was uncomfortably aware of Jal Oren's hooded eyes watching his exit. Jal would certainly report on Sam's shortcomings when his parents returned, if he didn't decide before then to deliver one of his justly feared summations of exactly what was wrong with Sam's behavior. But even one of Jal's lectures would pale to insignificance when his mother found out the truth about her son. Beyond that revelation, Sam daren't think. He couldn't imagine what would happen, or what his own future would be. The kingdom had to have an abhorsen in waiting and a royal heir. Elamir was demonstrably the perfect royal heir, so Sam had to be the abhorsen in waiting. Only he couldn't do it. Not wouldn't, as everyone was bound to think. Couldn't. That night, as he had done scores of times before, Sam unlocked the cupboard to the left of his workbench and steeled himself to look at the Book of the Dead. It sat on a shelf, shining with its own ominous light green that overshadowed the soft glow of the charter lights in the ceiling. He reached out to it, like a hunter trying to pat a wolf, in the vain hope that it might be only a friendly dog. His fingers touched the silver clasp, and the charter marks laid upon it. But before he could do more, a violent shooking overtook him, and his skin turned as cold as ice. Sam tried to still the shakes and ignore the cold, but he couldn't. He snatched back his hand and retreated to the front of the fireplace, where he crouched down in misery, hugging his knees. A week after his birthday, Sam received a letter from Nick, or rather, the remains of a letter, because it had been written on machine-made paper. Like most products of Ancelstier technology, the paper had begun to fail upon crossing the wall, and it was now crumbling into its component fibers. Sam had often told Nick in the past to use handmade paper, but he never did. Still, there was enough of it left for Sam to deduce that Nick was asking him for an Old Kingdom visa for himself and a servant. He intended to cross the wall at midwinter, and he would be grateful if Sam met him at the crossing point. Sam brightened. Nick could always cheer him up. He immediately consulted his almanac to see what midwinter in Ancelstier would correspond with in the Old Kingdom. Generally, the Old Kingdom was a full season ahead of Ancelstier, but there were some strange fluctuations that required double checking in an almanac, particularly around the solstices and the turn of the seasons. Old Kingdom Ancelstier almanacs, like Sam's, had been almost impossible to obtain once, but 10 years ago, Sabriel had lent hers to the royal printer, who had reset it to incorporate all the handwritten comments and marginalia of Sabriel and previous abhorsens. That had been a long and laborious process. The end result was aesthetically very pleasing, with clear, slightly indented type on crisp lined paper, but was very expensive. Sabriel and Touchstone were careful about who was allowed to have these almanacs. Samuth had been very proud when he was entrusted with one on his 12th birthday. Fortunately, the almanac had an exact correspondence for midwinter, rather than just an equation for Sam to work out, requiring moon sights and other observations. On that day in Ancelstier, it would be the day of ships in the Old Kingdom, in the 3rd week of spring. It was still many weeks off, but at least Sam had something positive to look forward to. After the letter from Nick, Sam's mood improved a little, and he got on better with everyone in the palace, except Elamir. The rest of winter passed without either of his parents coming home, and without any particularly terrible storms, or the intense, bone-numbing cold that sometimes rolled in from the northeast, accompanied by pods of lost whales who didn't otherwise enter the Sea of Sair. Weather-wise, it was a particularly mild winter, but in court and city, the people still spoke of it as a bad one. There had been more trouble all over the kingdom that season than in any of the last 10 winters. Trouble such as hadn't been seen since the early days of Touchstone's reign. Message hawks flew constantly to and from the Mews Tower, and Mistress Finny grew red-eyed and even more irritable than normal, as her children, the hawks, were hard-pressed to meet the demand for communication. Many of the messages the hawks carried were reports of the dead and of free magic creatures. A large portion turned out to be false, but all too many were real, and all required Sabriel's attention. There was other news that troubled Sam. One letter from his father reminded him too much of the terrible day on the perimeter, when the dead Sutherlings had attacked his cricket team, and he had faced the necromancer in death. Sam took the letter up the 2nd tallest tower to read over and think, while Brel paced around him. One particular section he read 3 times. The Ancelstier army, presumably under instructions from the government, has allowed a group of Sutherling volunteers to enter the Old Kingdom at one of the old crossing points on the wall, in contravention of all past agreements and common sense. Obviously, Coralini has gained further support, and this is a test of his plan to send all the Sutherlings into the kingdom. I have to put a stop to further crossings as best I can, and reinforce the guards at Barhedron. But there is no guarantee that the Ancestierans will not send more Sutherlings across, though General Tyndall has said he will delay acting on any such order, and warn us if he can. In any case, more than 1,000 Sutherlings have already crossed, and they are at least 4 days ahead of us. Apparently, they were met by local guides, but as no perimeter scouts were allowed to escort the refugees, I do not know whether these were even true men. We will pursue, of course, but there is a smell about this I do not like. I'm certain at least one free magic sorcerer is involved on our side of the wall, and the crossing point the Sutherlings used is the one closest to where you were ambushed, Samuth. The necromancer, thought Sam, as he folded the letter. He was glad the sun was out, and that he was in the palace, protected by wards and guards and running water. Bad news? Asked Brell. Just news, said Sam, but he was unable to suppress a shiver. Nothing the king and the Abhorsen can't deal with, said Brell, with total confidence. Wherever they are, whispered Sam. He put the letter inside his coat and went back downstairs, to his workshop, to lose himself in making things, in tiny details that required all his attention and the total dexterity of his hands. With every step, he knew he should be going to open the Book of the Dead. Typically, Sam's parents returned on a beautiful spring evening, long after Sam had climbed down from the tower and Brell's watch had ended. The wind had turned to the east. The sea of Sayre was shifting color from winter black to summery turquoise. The sun was still warm even as it sank into the west, and the swallows that lived on the cliffs were stealing wool from Sam's torn blanket for their nests. Sabriel arrived first, her paper wing skimming low over the practice yard, where Sam was sweating through 48 patterns of attack and defense with Sinel, one of the better guards. The shadow of the paper wing startled them both and allowed Sinel to take the final point, since she recovered while Sam was momentarily paralyzed. His day of doom had finally come, and all his prepared speeches and letters leaked out of his brain, as if his opponent had actually pierced his head rather than triumphantly clanging her wooden sword down on his heavily padded helmet. He was hurrying inside to change out of his practice armor when the trumpet sounded above the south gate. At first, he thought they were for his mother, till he heard other trumpets farther away, up at the west yard, where her paper wing would have landed. So the trumpets at the south gate had to be announcing the king. No one else got a fanfare. It was indeed Touchstone. Sam met him 20 minutes later in the family's private solar, a large room, 3 stories above the great hall, with a single, long window that looked down upon the city rather than the sea. Touchstone was looking out at his capital as Sam came in, watching the lights come on. Bright charter lights and soft oil lights, flickering candles and fires. It was one of the best times to be in Belissaire, at lighting up time on a warm spring evening. As usual, Touchstone looked tired, though he'd managed to wash and change out of armor and riding gear. He was wearing an Ancestieran-style bathrobe, his curly hair still wet from a hasty bath. He smiled as he saw Sam, and they shook hands. "You look better, Sam," said Touchstone, noting the flush in his son's face from the sword practice, "though I had hoped you'd also develop as a letter writer this winter." Said Sam. He'd sent only 2 letters to his father all winter, and a few notes at the bottom of some of Elamer's much more regular correspondence. Neither the letters nor the notes had contained anything very interesting, and nothing at all personal. Sam had actually drafted some that did, but like the ones to his mother, they'd ended up in the fire. "Dad, Sam began hesitantly, and he felt a surge of relief as he finally began to broach the subject he'd stewed on all winter. "Dad, I can't—" Before he could go on, the door swung open, and Elamer breezed in. Sam's mouth snapped shut, and he glared at her, but she ignored him and rushed straight to Touchstone, hugging him with evident relief. "Dad, I'm so glad you're home," she said, "and Mother too." "One big happy family," muttered Sam under his breath. "What was that?" asked Touchstone, a touch of sternness in his voice. "Nothing," said Sam. "Where's Mother?" "Down in the reservoir," replied Touchstone slowly. He kept one arm around Elamer and drew Sam in with the other. "Now, I don't want you to get too worried, but she's had to go to the Great Stones, because she's been wounded." "Wounded!" exclaimed Elamir and Sam together, turning in so that all three of them were in a tight circle. "Not seriously," Touchstone said hastily. "A bite to the leg from some sort of dead thing, but she couldn't attend to it at the time, and it went bad." Is she going to?" Elamir asked anxiously, staring down at her own leg in consternation. From the look on her face, it was plain that she found it hard to imagine Sabriel hurt, and not completely in command of herself and everything around her. "No, she's not going to lose her leg," Touchstone said firmly. "She has to go down to the Great Charterstones because both of us were simply too tired to cast the necessary healing spells, but we'll be able to down there. It's also the best place for all of us to have a private discussion, a family conference." The reservoir where the 6 great Charterstones stood was in many ways the heart of the Old Kingdom. It was possible to access the Charter, the very wellspring of magic, anywhere in the Old Kingdom, but the presence of ordinary Charterstones made it much easier, as if they were conduits to the Charter. However, the great Charterstones actually seemed to be of the Charter, not just connected to it. While the Charter contained and described all living things and all possibilities, and existed everywhere, it was particularly concentrated in the great stones, the wall, and the bloodlines of the royal family, as well as the Abhorsons and the Clare. Certainly, when 2 of the great stones were broken by Caragor and the royal family apparently lost, the Charter itself had seemed to weaken, allowing greater freedom to free magic and the dead. "Wouldn't it be better to have the conference up here after Mother's cast her spell?" asked Sam. Despite its importance to the kingdom, the reservoir had never been his favorite place, even before he had become so afraid of death. The stones themselves were comforting, even keeping the water around them warm, but the rest of the reservoir was cold and horrible. Touchstone's mother and sisters had been slain there by Caragor, and much later, Sabriel's father had died there too. Sam didn't want to think about what it must have been like when there were 2 broken stones, and Caragor lurked there in the darkness with his necromantic beasts and dead servants. "No," replied Touchstone, who had much more reason than his son to fear the place. But he had lost that fear years ago, in his long labor to repair the broken stones with his own blood and fragments of barely remembered magic. "It's the only place where we will definitely not be overheard, and there are too many things you both must know, and no others should. Bring the wine, Samuth. We'll need it." "Are you going like that?" asked Elamir, as Touchstone strode over to the fireplace and into the left-handed side of the ingle nook. He turned as she spoke, looked down on his robe and the twin swords belted across it, shrugged, and went on. Elamir sighed and followed him, and both disappeared into the darkness behind the fire. Sam scowled and picked up the earthenware jug of spiced wine that had been mulled and placed near the fire to keep hot. Then he followed, pressing his hand up against the rear of the ingle nook, charter marks flaring as the guard spell let him push open the secret door. Beyond that, he could already hear his father and sister clattering down the 156 steps that led to the reservoir, the great Charterstones, and Sabriel. And that is the end of chapter 23. That was a pretty long one again, but I hope you enjoyed that reading. I did, but I am sweating now. Now I'm too hot. But I'm going to go rest. And I will post the next chapter tomorrow evening at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, as usual. And until then, I hope you can get some rest. I hope I can get some rest. I hope you eat something good. Stay warm. It's freezing outside. And on a good note, tomorrow I'm going to go get a Christmas tree with my family. So that will be a nice little reprieve from feeling yucky today. Hopefully I'll feel better tomorrow. I know I will. So until I see you tomorrow, take care, and as always, may your magic manifest. Bye.